Welcome to the totally safe, completely not haunted Camp Crystal Lake, aka Dear Watchers, an omniversal comic book podcast where we do a deep dive into the multiverse.
We are traveling with you to the Camp Crystal Lake research facility, to the Camp Crystal Lake Gene Lab, and through the stories and the worlds that make up an omniverse of fictional realities we all love. And your watchers on this journey are me, Guido X. That was an easy one.
Me, Uber Rob.
Oh, of course. I should have picked the Uber. I forgot. Though they are one and the same.
Yes, true. Synonyms. And before we take our dive into the crystal clear waters of Crystal Lake, that's a lot of crystal, Guido, what's new in our little section of the multiverse?
What's that, Jason? Oh, okay. So Jason wanted me to tell everyone, go back and listen to the last episode if you didn't already, because we do our first conversation about Jason Voorhees in our Jason vs. Leatherface coverage last episode. And it actually does give a great deal of background on Jason, which will help with today's episode if you're not too familiar. And we decided to stay in the world of Friday the 13th, which was weird, but happy Halloween.
Yes, because this is coming out, if you're listening to it when it comes out, the day before Halloween.
Indeed.
And if you're not listening to it on that day, I'm a firm believer Halloween can be any day of the year, so it's
true.
Evergreen content.
That is Kate Pearson of the B-52's latest single. Is Every Day is Halloween. So yeah, and happy Halloween. Keep sending us pictures. After last episode, a few people tagged us online with pictures of their family in hockey masks or different cosplay they've seen related to the things we've talked about. So keep sending it. And one quick side note, we have our first print ad on its way out in a really great British magazine that I've been a fan of for a few years since I discovered it, called Comic Scene. That's Comic SCENE, and you can check out comicscene.org to order some of those issues. So the digital issue of their 2024 big year book issue that's coming out is there. We are the back cover ad, and it was really fun to do that. I wanted to do it really to support them and support their crowdfunding campaign. The print issue, I think, is supposed to be out in a few weeks, but it's just cool that exists, and it's a good reminder. If you aren't familiar with that magazine, they've done some issues dedicated to like different eras of comics and mostly British comics, but they'll have good articles. Like this one has a good article about Wonder Woman in it. So check out Comic Scene and you'll see a familiar ad on the back page.
Is there like a Charles Atlas ad in there too, or X-Ray Specs? Any of the classics that we can be right next to?
No, it's all not, no.
Well, if you are joining us for the first time, we have three parts of our journey through the multiverse today: origins of the story, exploring multiversity, and pondering possibilities. So thank you for taking this trip through the dark and scary woods with us.
And remember, you can leave a 5-star review wherever you're listening to us, and even on the other platforms such as Apple Podcasts and Spotify, and find us on all social media. Send us those Halloween pictures. Tell us what your favorite horror movie comic book crossover is at Dear Watchers.
And with that, dear watchers, Mother wants me to make sure that you know. Welcome to episode 119, and let's check out what's happening in the Omniverse with our travels to today's alternate universe.
By the way, that is the video game sound effect for those wondering.
And of course, the composer always says it's Kiki Ma Ma for kill from mother, but no one ever hears that. It's clearly
no, although that is the name of the video game track. It's Kiki Ma Ma Ma, which also sounds like a drag queen track. So.
It does, Kiki Ma. Well, today we are taking a rocket past Mars. Well, also jumping the shark to find out the answer.
The shark is well jumped in this episode.
That exploded, and we are answering the question: what if the original Jason from Friday the 13th faced off against Uber Jason from Jason X in space?
The question everyone's been wondering. And this is yet another unknown world. It is a world that exists in 3 different comics and 2 different comic book series. So that's shocking that this world existed.
And a film, too.
It is all strung together. I guess it's kind of canonical to the film.
Yeah.
I think the filmmaker would have to confirm that. So we're going to call it a variant sequel on the film. Sort of, but it does pick up right after, and we'll explain all of that soon. I don't have a catchy name for this Earth. I guess Earth facing off against yourself with your dead mother in your head. I don't know. And then
Earth
the
topless scientists. I think I do my best thinking without a shirt on.
Oh, that's awful to laugh at because it's just awful in everything we looked at today. But tell us the background on the film we watched, because this was a cross-media spectacular. So tell us some background on that, please.
Yeah, so Paramount had released Friday the 13th movies, every Friday the 13th movie, going back to the first one in 1980. Series creator Sean S. Cunningham, he really wanted, this was his goal in life, was to create a Freddy versus Jason movie. But New Line controlled the rights to Freddy. They're even known as the house that Freddy built. So Paramount actually sold the rights to Jason to New Line, but they actually kept the Friday the 13th name, which is still causing issues today in the future of this franchise.
And I wonder what we also watched. We're not going to talk about this at all, but we watched the Friday the 13th TV show, which has absolutely nothing to do with Friday the 13th except uses the name. So
yeah, no, but that was
obviously
all
lots of like name rights, weird things that have
totally
happened.
Yeah, that was all still back in the Paramount days. But Freddy vs. Jason did not take off, so Cunningham and New Line made Jason Goes to Hell the final Friday, and that even ends with Jason's mask being sucked into the underworld by Freddy's glove. But Freddy vs. Jason remained in development hell.
Along with Jason's mask.
Yes.
And where everything that we watched and read today belongs.
Well, Sean worried that people were forgetting Jason, or the rights were going to revert back to Paramount, who knows. But Cunningham decided to make another Jason movie while Freddy vs. Jason was coming together, and that was Jason X. And they even said it in the future of 2010 to not mess with the Freddy vs. Jason continuity. Not that these are series people are very concerned with the continuity of that.
It was an interesting choice, though. You and I, when watching it, were discussing what the purpose of it was. And it does feel like it was meant to hold a prime canon, which is really an interesting choice for such an absurd premise. But
yes.
It was constructed so that it could almost be like the final chapter after the chapters that we hadn't yet seen.
Mm-hmm. Totally,
So
yeah. And there was this 9-year gap between Jason X and Jason Goes to Hell. That's the longest gap in Friday the 13th history until now. And in terms of some of the outer space stuff, Fangoria magazine had once asked John Carpenter what would it take him to return to the Halloween franchise. And he said, maybe joking, that he would have to take Michael Myers to space.
What year was that interview? Because I wonder if that is like what inspired some of these weird franchises ending up in outer space.
That's what people seem to believe. It was in like the late 80s or early 90s. And having just seen John at New York Comic-Con, this is the kind of answer I think he would give to a lot of these things. Because then we got Leprechaun in space, we got Pinhead in space, and now we got Jason in space. And
so stupid.
They're all ended up in space. And the writer Todd Farmer of this film really intended to be a much more serious, straightforward aliens kind of movie, but a rewriter was brought in to add a lot of jokes kind of off the screen model.
I don't even know if I'd call them jokes, but sure.
Like a lightness, maybe. And the film was actually held for 2 years before it was actually released. And when it was released 6 months earlier in Spain than it was in the US. So then a lot of people in the US started to get like illegal copies of it anyway to be able to see it. Very weird. I don't know why they did that. but it was budgeted at 14 million. It only made 17 million, but done 1 year later, Freddy vs. Jason finally came out, and that was a huge monster, pun intended, hit that made like 4 times its budget.
And that should have then wiped Jason X from existence and made everyone forget it happened, except there were comics. and they are here to remind us forever.
Yes. So what about these comics? Because we talked a lot about the Friday the 13th comics in our last episode, but what else can you tell us about this run in particular?
Well, last episode we did some of the earlier comics from the 90s. Now this is later, so the license at this point in 2005 has been picked up by Avatar. Avatar is known for their gritty, adult, violent, bloody, nude comics. They've published a lot of Alan Moore, Garth Ennis, Warren Ellis over the years. So they, with this license, start doing some one-shots and miniseries, all either by writers Brian Polito or Mike Wolfer.
Yeah, I think it's crazy that all of them are by 2 people, sometimes together, sometimes separately. So that's just wild that it was like, you 2 guys, you do all of these comics.
Yeah, maybe they wanted it, or I don't know. But after Jason versus Jason X, which we read today, Avatar did just one final Friday the 13th book by the same author that was a follow-up to his previous miniseries. So all of these, they kind of have subtitles, and they're all like sequels or prequels, or they're all, it's strange. None of them are just sort of a straightforward ongoing until the license transfers to Wildstorm, when it does become an ongoing. But this is Wildstorm in the early days of the DC acquisition, which is funny. So DC has published Friday the 13th comics via Wildstorm, but we will save those for another day. And as we mentioned last episode, Avatar, along with Friday the 13th, had licenses for Nightmare on Elm Street, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Night of the Living Dead. So they were leaning into the horror adaptations. And one quick quote from Mike Wolfer, the writer of two of today's 3 comics we read. When Avatar Press obtained the licensing rights in 2005, I was asked if I'd like to work on one of the titles, and if so, which one. I was always a huge fan of Friday the 13th, so naturally I jumped at it. I was originally the artist on the series, working from scripts by Brian Polito, but I eventually assumed the writing with Jason versus Jason X and Friday the 13th, the Fear Book. So,
and is that common for an artist to jump to writing like that?
I don't know if it's common, but it's not unheard of. There are people who switch back and forth. It's not common, certainly, but it is not completely unique. So that is the background on the comics, and we'll get into what we read and why we read it in our second segment today.
Well, what is your background, Guido, on Jason X, aka Jason 10, but Jason X is more fun?
Yeah. I don't know. I knew nothing about it. I knew it existed. I knew it involved space, and I knew, because they sort of, and you mentioned that they were supposed to sort of not spoil Uber Jason, but they put him on the poster and all the marketing. So I could picture Uber Jason. I knew like the silver, very 90s looking mask, kind of super villain mask, if you will. So I knew the look. I knew it was space, and I knew nothing else. I've never seen it, and I will never see it again. And that's a preview of what I think, if my opinion has not been more and more clear. You know, doing this episode, I had a lot of sympathy for our friends Mike and Jessica at 10 Cent Takes, because I was thinking, gosh, they encounter stuff that is just not good all the time. And while I try to be positive, it's going to be really hard on this episode, because I did not like this subject matter. What was your background as a Friday fan with Jason X?
Yeah. So as we mentioned on the last episode, Friday the 13th is my favorite horror franchise. And 2002, I would have been in high school. I would have been the perfect audience to see this movie, but I didn't see it. And I was seeing so many movies in the theaters then.
It had a terrible distribution, especially with the box office, you said. I bet it was either in very few theaters, or they put it in and pulled it out within like a week.
Yeah, it came out a week or two before the first Spider-Man movie, which probably gobbled up everything.
Yeah.
So I don't remember seeing. I don't remember the first time I saw this movie. A friend of mine who's a drag queen used to do Friday the 13th movies every year at a bar in New York City. And I probably saw it there. And then I've seen it like one other time. This was probably like my third time seeing it. But it's, yeah, well, we'll get into backgrounds on it. Yes.
And has it, before we get further, well, I guess we could talk about this with the movie, but I'll ask you now anyway, because I started. Is it ever referred to again in movie form?
No, because we only had Freddy versus Jason after this, which takes place before this movie. And then we had the reboot movie, which I kind of like a lot, but which is
so if someone wanted
continuity.
to go into the full prime canon of the original Jason series, which they're not going to do, but if someone wanted to, this is technically the end point. This is the end of the sacred timeline.
Yes, I guess so. Yeah, and what's weird too is then I guess you know that Jason would have survived in one way or another, Freddy versus Jason as well, because he's now in this movie. So,
right, cryogenically.
Yeah. Well, even before that, yeah, when he's just kept. Well, we'll get into it. So, let's rescue our drowned, small, deformed child and create a franchise with origins of the story.
Right now on this very show, you're going to get the answer to all your questions. Our amazing story begins a few years ago.
So first up is the film Jason X from April 2002 from Crystal Lake Entertainment, Friday X Productions, and New Line Cinema.
It's directed by Jim Isaac, produced by Noel Cunningham, written by Todd Farmer. It stars Kane Hodder as Jason. He's the most well-known, and I think you said this is his final outing as Jason?
It is until he came back to do the video game pretty recently, yeah.
I'm not even going to name the rest of the cast because they probably want to remain anonymous. The director, Jim Isaac, worked on the special effects and second unit for David Cronenberg and Sean S. Cunningham, and did work on Return of the Jedi and Gremlins in the past. He would go on to do the remake of My Bloody Valentine and Drive Angry. And
well, the screenwriter would go on to write those other movies.
The screenwriter. And the producer of this is the son of the series creator, and this is the only film he's produced. So we can assume he's a Nepo baby for sure. So can you summarize this movie?
Okay, it's 2010 and Crystal Lake is now a research facility that has captured Jason Voorhees. Jason, of course, escapes and the scientist, Rowan LaFontaine, managed to cryo-freeze Jason, but not before he stabs her, causing her to freeze also. Cut to 435 years later. The Earth is no longer inhabitable and a research team brings both Jason and Rowan aboard their ship. They unfreeze and heal Rowan, but Jason unfreezes as well and goes on a killing spree. When the female android KM-14 blows up Jason, the ship's system heals him, turning him into a cyborg. Into a cyborg Uber Jason, but
which is how he's credited.
Yes, not us. But ultimately, the revamped Jason is defeated and sent hurtling back into a lake on the new Earth.
So, yeah. Whoa. I mean, I'll say the summary makes it sound a lot more fun than it is. And I'm sorry to people who like it. More power to you. I'm glad you like it. I hated this movie. I hated it.
Yeah. So, I mean, I read the Scarecrow movie guide review of it beforehand because it had been a few years since I had seen it. And they compared it to Bride of Chucky, which I love, in that they were like, oh, it's like taking the tropes of a Friday the 13th movie, but making it very knowing and having fun with it. And I thought, ooh, this is going to be fun then. I don't really think that's what this movie is. What do you think?
I firmly believe, and you have tried to find an information and seem to think this can't be true, but I think there is just no way this wasn't a script for something else that they then just made a Jason script, because the movie is just your generic alien-inspired sci-fi movie where the threat is picked up by a spacecraft, put on the ship, wakes up, and starts killing. I mean, it's so generic. And then there's really the glimpse of originality comes in at the end when you get into some sort of like hologram situation, and you're making him think that he's actually back at Camp Crystal Lake, and like you're like, oh, okay, they could have played with this, but I'm sure the budget was a huge part of it, because I have to say, as a fan of things like Babylon 5 and a fan of 90s cheese and low budget sci-fi, this was so bad. I actually think the production design on this might have been worse than something like Andromeda or Cleopatra 2525 or any of those shows. I mean, because maybe it's because I knew I was watching a movie, but like it just looked so bad that because it was generic and looked bad, it just really did nothing for me.
Yeah. Well, and you mentioned Andromeda, and this shares a few cast members with that, including our main final girl, who Alexa Doing, who was on Andromeda.
Is the final girl the cyborg? No, because the robot's ahead for part of the movie.
Yeah,
so
but she was on Andromeda as well. So there was a lot of Andromeda actors and people who were on the various Stargate series. Definitely has that shot in Canada feel. And you were saying the budget, they were actually considering a few different things to do with Jason. One was put him in like a submarine, which would make sense, I guess, like have an underwater story. Some were in snow, but that was deemed, I think it was going to be much more expensive to shoot in snow than it would be to shoot in fake outer space. One of the stories was to have actually Jason tormenting the NASCAR circuit. I don't know why, but that was one of the ideas that was thrown out there. Crossover. But yeah, well, Todd Farmer, the screenwriter, said that he intended this to be like a pretty serious movie that got kind of rewritten. So I don't know if it was really intended to be something else, but it has a lot of debt to the Alien and Aliens. And even the character Todd Farmer, he's in the movie. The character he plays is named Dallas, which is Tom Skerritt's name in the first Alien movie. But it's got so much, especially the whole plot is kind of the Aliens in terms of her waking up in the future and the alien is still there. I mean, that's all just directly ripped
like
off
the
for this.
Android and all of it.
The android, totally. Yeah, it's very similar.
I think the only thing they did to make it Friday the 13th-ish was include the sort of teenage, although they're not teenagers, but like the young, horny people sexuality aspect of it. And like that when people have sex, they get killed. And there was even a scene where I said to you, like, is it almost as if the sexual energy is like bringing him back to life because they intercut like his resurrection with like all these different people and having sex. And I think it's one of the most 90s, just awfully done, sophomoric, terrible humor, misogynist stuff ever. Like it's not even entertaining or enjoyable, or there's nothing interesting about the sexuality that it adds. I think you and I both laughed hysterically at the end when he goes to the camp and they just the girls are just in their underwear, and then he kills them with the sleeping bag, which you said he'd done in a previous movie.
Which is the
only interesting moments that uses the Friday the 13th lore, but in terms of the depiction of women's bodies, it's ridiculous. I mean, as you said, there's the scientist outfit, which is like just a crop top shirt with your bare shoulders, which makes no sense.
Yeah, to trick him late in the movie, they create a hologram, and it's two young women, and they're like, oh, we're smoking pot and having premarital sex, and then they take their tops off. And that's funny because it's actually commenting on the series. And when you see the nudity there, it's like, oh, okay, that's part of the joke. The rest of the movie, it's like, oh, these are supposed to be students who are in a very serious scientific mission. And so why are they just all suddenly having sex?
It also never goes that far. I mean, I don't like exploitation movies, but was this rated R? If it was rated R.
It was rated R, but there was very few cuts.
It's an odd R because there's very little in it. I guess there are women's nipples. I don't remember if there's a lot of cursing, but it's an odd R. So. I mean, this movie reminds me more of something like The Faculty or something. Like, It sort of is flirting. It's like skirting sexuality. And part of that is probably just because it's either so poorly executed or just so horrendous that it doesn't feel real to me. So it feels super PG-13.
I was listening to the Halloweenies podcast, what they had to say about this movie, and they said it was basically like if Maxim produced a film. Which is true, because there's like a little bit of toplessness, but for the most part, as you're saying, there's not a lot of like actual sex. Like you go back and watch some of the earlier movies, and the violence too. It's a lot of this. There's one of the best kills in any Friday the 13th movie, which is where one of our sexy scientists, her head is frozen in like dry ice or whatever it is, and frozen there, and then he takes her head out and like smashes it, and her head explodes, and it's all practical effect. It's really cool, and that's pretty early. She's the first one killed on the ship, but then all the other ones are just machete kills, and most of the time he's kind of cutting away from it even.
Well, that's
so
the thing.
Don't even see them.
I guess it was budgetary, but that's why I was questioning the R, because there's not a lot of gore in this movie either. But I guess it was, I'm sure, budget reasons. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I guess before we move away from this, like, is there anything you find interesting about Jason being in space? Like, even outside of this movie, what about just the concept? Do you think it's do you think the concept has potential, or do you think the concept is ridiculous? Like, as a fan of the series, what do you think of the concept?
I think it could have worked if they had actually played with more space elements, but
there is nothing.
They don't really. Like there's no moment where they release.
That's it.
Yeah, they don't release the they turn off the gravity. Artificial gravity, for example. Like, what if they were all floating around? And that would be interesting. There's a little bit of Jason actually outside the ship, but it's like super quick. That would be interesting too. So there's the things they could have done. I don't think it's an inherently bad concept, but yeah, it just seemed underutilized. It could have been anywhere else. But my favorite thing is David Cronenberg does have a cameo in the early part of the movie and does get stabbed by like a giant piece of machinery. So that is quite fun. But now let's talk about Jason X in the comics with Exploring Multiversity.
I am your guide through these vast new realities. Follow me and ponder the question, what if?
And today we are asking the question, what if the original Jason from Friday the 13th faced off against Uber Jason from Jason X in space? And this is Jason X Special from December 2005 from Avatar Press. And Friday the 13th, Jason versus Jason X from March 2006 and June 2006 from Avatar Press, issues 1 and 2.
So the Jason X Special is written by Brian Polito, pencils and inks by Sebastian Fiumara, color by Mark Sweeney. Potentially no letters or editors known. They're not credited, and we didn't dig around too much, but not credited. Perhaps some of the other team also did those things and just it wasn't listed. And the same is true actually for the Jason vs. Jason X titles. These, though, are written and drawn by Mike Wolfer with color by Andrew Dahlhaus, and letters and editor are unknown. So that first comic picks up exactly at the end of the movie with Uber Jason landing on this other Earth. We find out that another scientist wearing her scientist outfit named Chrissy was tracking the events that we'd seen in the movie, had planned to capture Jason to use his regenerating genetic material to save her husband. But the ghost of Pamela Voorhees is in the machines and the nanobites and takes over in Jason's brain and helps Chrissy and kill Chrissy and her husband via Jason, of course. And Uber Jason arrives on a new ship, which is a big place called the Fun Club with lots of naked women. Lots of naked women.
Scantily clad men and naked women.
And so then obviously this was written as sort of a bridge to get from the movie to the core series, Jason vs. Jason X. So in this 2-issue series, picking up right from the special, Uber Jason is running amok on the Fun Club. A group of scavengers raid the Grendel, the ship from Jason X the film, unaware that the original Jason, using the severed head from the movie and the nanobites and the bodies of his victims, has pieced himself back together. And so we've got original Jason now. It's a little confusing. Original Jason now killing this crew, except for one member who escapes to the Fun Club with now Jason on her heels. And there, Jason and Uber Jason meet each other. They battle it out. Uber Jason, of course, has Pamela Voorhees in his head. It's not clear if the other Jason can also hear her. They sort of mind meld at times. Their eyes like lock and they have lightning bolts going across them. Really unclear what is happening. But this person who escaped, Melba, and another android, of course, in the same android outfit, escape. Uber Jason defeats the original Jason after a lengthy battle, pulls out his brain and inserts it in his own head so that the voice of Pamela he's been hearing and the memories of Jason are finally united together in his head. And the comic ends. I can't believe these are the words coming out of my mouth. Whoa. It's a weird one. It's a weird one. I don't know where to start. You start. What did you think? Did you enjoy it?
Here's what I enjoyed. I enjoyed in the first comic, the Brian Polito comic. I liked the actual device that Chrissy, the scientist, so her husband's dying, and she wants to capture Jason because he's always regenerating his tissue, and they're going to use that tissue's sample to save her husband. I thought that was actually like an interesting concept.
And that's in the movie too. There's one line, I can't remember where it is, but if it's in the opening sequence when they have him captive or if it's later, but they talk about that they were trying to harvest his tissue because he had these like healing powers.
Yeah, and in the movie the kind of crooked professor is going to sell the body off for experimentation and like military warfare, so maybe it's coming in there too. But I thought that was an interesting, like I was like, oh, that's a really interesting concept to kind of making Jason into and I think some of the other comics dealt with this, actually make him into a military figure or to use his tissue to actually improve Earth and have that be the catalyst. So I thought that was really well done. Now everything around it might not have been as well done, but that core concept I'm on board with.
I mean, so if you can separate out what Avatar Press is doing, which is borderline softcore porn, the comics version of softcore porn, which is a lot of nude women and ridiculous poses, ridiculous outfits, and then the violence primarily hits the women. There's a few men who get like disemboweled or severed in half. But so separating all that, I'd say the other thing that happens with the art in here is it's confusing. And I don't know if it was rushed. I don't know if it's just not the strongest execution. Maybe the artists like just didn't have a sense of how to do panel breakdowns. Maybe the page count changed midway. Like, I don't know what the reason is, but the art is just confusing. You at one point thought you were reading the pages out of order because we were reading it digitally, but it's just that it jumps around and it's not clear what's happening when. And that makes then even like the final battle scene, which should be really interesting, makes it slightly confusing. I'm sort of like, okay, who's winning now? And it's like original Jason seems to have the upper hand at one point. Then Jason X just suddenly comes and chops his head off. And I'm like, I can't follow the battle. So the art and the breakdowns themselves took away from the comic, which I wouldn't have enjoyed anyway, but they didn't help, certainly.
Yeah. One thing I'll say, though, is that we talked about for the last episode, Jason versus Leatherface, that like most comics, it's not really a versus. Like there's a couple of pages of a fight. Most of them is them getting along, and it's the same thing with Superman versus Spider-Man and everything. I will say the second issue of Jason versus Jason X is just one giant fight. Like they're just fighting the entire time.
Well, and that's what I didn't know when they do
it,
their mind meld thing with their eyes. I actually wondered if it was going to be like a Jason versus Leatherface thing, if they were going to suddenly like unite, but no, they stayed antagonists. The way they united was via brain, a literal mind meld, I guess. Brain mush.
And I liked the introduction, although it didn't quite make sense. I don't know really how she was there. I liked including Pamela Voorhees because I always like that aspect of the series, and I like Pamela as a character and bringing her back in. And I believe they wanted to use her in the movie, but then they couldn't get Betsy Palmer, who originated her. So obviously in the comics, just like her voice, so that works. But I don't quite know how she was in the machines, or I guess she was like,
I guess she was
I don't know,
embedded in the biological matter of Jason. Who knows?
Yeah.
Who knows? It's all so ridiculous. Everything about it is ridiculous. I guess if you're coming to this comic for the same thing, well, here's what I'll say. It is remarkably follows suit of the movie Jason X.
Mm-hmm.
In tone, in messiness, in sexuality, in exploitation. Like it really felt similar. So that's a plus for it. If you liked Jason X or you want more Jason X, like this comic is so similar. It's a little confusing. There's lots of random female nudity or skimpy clothing, and then Jason just terrorizes, sometimes good, sometimes mediocre kills, but it's what you're there for.
Yeah, and there was actually a lot of attention to detail. Like you said, like this, you were actually confused at first if the scientist was the same person or the android, because they're wearing the same clothes.
Yeah.
So it's like, oh, that is like a scientist outfit. That is like what the androids wear. And then I noticed that when the original Jason is reconstituted, he's using the futuristic machete from Jason X, the movie. And that's because the original machete is been transformed into Uber Jason's weapon. So original Jason is now stuck with the this is a lot of words. Original Jason is stuck with the futuristic machete. So that's like just a weird little detail of like, oh, they actually like took that into account, and all of that, to your point, is like coming from the movie
carefully. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So
and there's a few other little Easter eggs there, like the other android who we meet is named Alice, which is the name of the final girl in the original Friday the 13th movie, and they even have a line of like, that's such an old-fashioned name.
They do, I know, because they all have weird names like that.
Melba and well, they're not all. One is like Chrissy. That's not like
That's true.
I don't know.
But
Melba's not even that weird.
One of the one man that gets killed, his name, I remember thinking like, oh, someone was imagining that in the year 24, whatever. That's what a person's name is going to be.
Mm-hmm. Now, also going back to what you were saying about the other movie, don't you think it would actually have been more interesting if it hadn't been like a research facility, but it had been like the fun club where the movie was actually set? Like, put it maybe in some kind of weird pleasure ship or something like that. That at least is a little bit more interesting.
It also would have made it less alien, less like a direct copy of Alien,
totally,
in a good way.
Yeah.
But I'm sure it was budgetary. Obviously, in the comic, they could go further. So, do you want to go back to this world on screen or on page? Like, do you want more Jason versus Jason X?
No, I think I'm good. And think because I'm old-fashioned, I like the original Jason design. I don't love the Uber Jason design, so I wouldn't want to see that be the look of Jason moving on for
aren't there
eternity.
other Jasons that use that? What I don't like the Jason, and this is Uber, but I feel like there's others that do, where like his he looks like the Toxic Avenger, like pushing out past the mask. So there's like all the kind of scarred, lumpy tissue, and it pushes out past the hockey mask.
Yeah.
That's Uber Jason. But also, I feel like there's other Jasons that look like that, and I don't like that quite as much. I like the more realistic looking.
Yeah, I mean, starting
versions.
with the 6th movie, he becomes a zombie. Before that, he is just a normal guy, so you don't see that. But then, yeah, he starts to get more and more Toxic Avenger-like as those movies go on. And actually, Sean Cunningham always said he hated the hockey mask, and I'm wondering if that's almost one of the reasons for the redesign in Jason X, which was like, okay, let's not make it really look like a hockey mask. Let's just make it look like another very metallic robot-like mask.
Make it look like any sci-fi movie or TV show era 90s character mask. Yeah. So, I mean, it's an interesting exercise in multiverse, if you will, in mashup, which I think we'll talk about in just a moment. But as a comic, it's interesting that instead of just a sequel, because clearly the sequel part of this, Jason X Special, is meant to get you to Jason versus Jason X. So instead of just doing a sequel to Jason X, like someone thought, ooh, what if we resurrect original Jason and have them fight off? So it's interesting, because there wasn't, in all of Avatar's publications, there wasn't anything else with Jason X, right? This is it.
Yeah, this was it. It was those 3, and maybe also it coming not too long after Freddy versus Jason. That was maybe part of it as well. I mean, so this was Jason versus Jason X is 3 years later, but maybe they were still kind of, let's use the momentum from that, because that was such a huge hit after a long time of neither of those franchises having a hit. So maybe they were like, the versus format, that's the way that we need to go.
Oh, that's true. Yeah. All right. Well, let's talk about the versus format in our next segment.
Move into our pondering possibilities.
Will the future you describe be averted?
And just so I feel smarter in this last segment, I'm gonna take my top off. And that was my favorite jokes actually in the Brian Polito comic, where they're actually like, "Oh, talking science, it makes me feel so sexy. I want to take," like, that was kind of the knowing wink, wink. But yeah,
it was. And then what's funny? So this couple, and these comics are so hard to find, so we shared a more detailed summary, and I'll share this detailed scene, because this couple start having sex because she gets turned on by science, and they're thinking, they see Jason fall into the lake. The guy starts saying like E=mc², and like spitting out random science things. And then Jason kills them with a tree, like an entire tree. He just picks up a tree and smashes them. So that is a silly, fun moment.
Yeah.
All right. But our final
anyway,
segment.
back to this segment. So what are we talking about for our pondering possibilities?
So since there are no other Jason X comics, and there is nowhere else to go with that character, thankfully, we're just going to ponder this setup of characters versus other versions of themselves. We've probably encountered it in some ways over our 118 other episodes, but this is definitely the most explicit, where they are taking a character, finding a way. In this case, it's not time travel, it's not the multiverse, it's nanobite regeneration, finding a way to pull that character back and having them fight another version of themselves. And so, does this work? Should there be more of it? Is there less of it? And then eventually we'll share our dream person versus themselves matchup. But let's start just overall. What do you think of this kind of story?
I think it's a really fun setup. I don't think it really works well here, in part because Jason is such a non-entity as a character. And also, why wouldn't Uber Jason just always kick regular Jason's butt? Because one of them is Uber. He's like the souped up version.
It's in his name.
And yeah, I don't know. So that just doesn't work. But if they were more fairly connected, like the example I'm actually thinking is in Army of Darkness, and the Evil Dead movies, you often have like an evil
Yeah.
ash that's forming, and that
That's true.
is
And we
like
did
a lot
discuss
more
that.
fun. And then you get like an actor like Bruce Campbell who can then play the evil version for the also in the movie, and it gives that person a lot to do.
Well, what that
works.
does well is that's a completely different version of him, to the point where like the first few times he's on screen, you're even wondering, is that Bruce Campbell? And then
Yeah,
you're like,
yeah.
oh, it is. And then you find out like his origin story, and then he was one of the little ones, and blah blah. So I think that's the key here, and in part because, well, for whatever reason, like they had to amp up original Jason, so him and Uber Jason don't seem all that distinct. What
Exactly,
they could have
yeah.
done, like maybe they should have turned Uber Jason into like some futuristic cyborg, like given him some arm machine gun or something, and then although then original Jason is just screwed, but still they could have distanced the two characters.
But then
Yeah.
could it have been like stuff that like water or something, like he rusts or something that or electricity shorts him out? So
Right.
you should have
Find
leaned
some
into the
weakness.
robot cyborg aspect of it.
Yeah. It's funny. I guess there are a lot of examples. There are a good number of classic examples, certainly in comics, of characters facing themselves, but it's not as common a trope as you'd think it would be. I'm trying to think of if there are countless examples, and there really aren't.
The other one that just I guess based on this because he's also a cyborg is Superman, right? Is Superman versus Cyborg Superman, and there's a bunch of.
If you want to
Supermen
count
running
that
around.
as that, I mean, it's a different person. He's a different person. So I don't know that would count. That's more like just an evenly matched, similar power set type thing. But that it's not a Superman from like a different universe. And it's interesting because as multiversal as we know comics are, that's why our podcast exists. Like there hasn't been a great, there's been a few, I mean, I guess Infinite Crisis actually does this interestingly. You take an alternate Earth version of that character, have it be the villain and play that out. But there hasn't been like a Red Sun Superman versus Prime Earth Superman, like big battle world matchup. And it feels like there could be more of that. But like you're saying with the Jasons, it might just not lend itself, as we said with Army of Darkness. It might work when the two versions are so different. They can't be too similar. So yeah, I'm curious. I don't know if I like this story trope or not, because I don't think I've seen quite enough of it. One good fun one is actually Buffy has, Willow and Evil Willow.
Yeah.
So that's fun. That one though plays so much more with just an alternate version kind of trope. There's not as much the battle trope. So I don't know if I like the notion of the battle of the alternates so much.
We talked about back in our Age of Apocalypse that we'd love to see Apocalypse versus Apocalypse.
Yeah,
as
see,
well.
and those are examples of things where I'm like, that hasn't existed. And that gets me, I'll tell you my dream matchup. I couldn't not choose two. I had to choose two. And both I wanted to choose comic ones. I'm sure there are countless others, but one is the more sort of fun one. I was thinking fun and fairly easy is what we were saying with the AOA one. But I was thinking like there have been comic book adaptations of the Fox franchise X-Men, but they have never, for probably very good reasons, existed in the 616. Wouldn't it be fun if there's just one throwaway issue where the X-Men actually fight like the Halle Berry, James Marsden, Famke Janssen, Hugh Jackman X-Men, Patrick Stewart X-Men, like in the black leather, they encounter them, like the jokes that would go between them. I mean, I just think that would be really fun to take the Fox X-Men movie team and pit them up against the core canonical 616 X-Men team. So that was the fun one I was thinking. The less fun one, but really interesting one to me would be actually Promethea, because as our listeners know, I love Promethea.
Yeah.
our bonus podcast is all about Promethea issue by issue. And there's only ever been one other version of Promethea. DC tried to introduce her, and we'll eventually talk about this on our bonus podcast when we get back into a rhythm with that. DC pulled her in for one Justice League storyline and tried to introduce her into what was then the Prime DC Earth. And it was not well received, of course, and they have not done it again, and I doubt that they ever will do it again. I think that would be sort of fun, especially because Promethea is so meta and about story. I think it would be really fun to have the Promethea, Alan Moore's Promethea. Obviously, in my dream, Alan Moore's writing this, which means it will absolutely never happen. So have the Promethea meet this like comic bookified DC superhero version of Promethea that got introduced and start exploring that, like, and the meta nature of that. I think that would be really fun. So those are the two things I thought about when I dreamed up a Jason versus Jason X scenario. What's your dream, Jason versus Jason X?
Well, I think the character that people often have polls about the most as to like, oh, who played this the best is Batman. So I do think it would be fun to see a big meta Batman movie where you had all different kinds of Batmen, making sure that like Val Kilmer, who might have been my favorite Batman, is not like left out of it as well. But then, you know, that you've got Adam West, that you've got the Kevin Conroy animated one. Maybe you also throw in like the Frank Miller, the Dark Knight Returns.
But who are the two who
version.
fight? Who are the Jason versus Jason X?
I think this one's like a full big melee of a bunch of different people.
Just a brawl.
Yeah. And then maybe you have the dark, moody ones like Ben Affleck and Rob Pattinson, like they're bonding together. But then you have like Adam West and like George Clooney. They're like the fun ones. And then Kevin Conroy, it's like Val Kilmer. They're in like the middle.
I do wonder if one day, when it wouldn't be quite as clearly a copy of Into the Spider-Verse, if one day there would be like a DC animated movie like that takes just 20 different Batmen and tells a story. It doesn't have the
Catwoman would be
comic
fun
foundation
too. Yeah.
that like the Spider-Verse has a comic foundation, but it'd still be fun. Maybe in 20 years they'll do it again when they're far enough removed from Into the Spider-Verse that it doesn't just feel like they're copying.
Yeah, even Catwoman, you've got like the 3 Catwomen from the original series / movie. You've got
true.
Anne Hathaway, you've got Halle Berry, you've got Zoe Kravitz. So like there's like, I don't know, there's I guess because those franchises have been around so long, they've done so much recasting. It just would be fun because you've got little links between the different characters, and some they're playing it more dark, and some are playing it more campy, and so I don't know, something like that. But I agree. I think something animated like they kind of did when they brought back the 66 animated ones, that would be fun. Mash them all together.
Or here's to stay on horror and Halloween as we wrap up. My favorite franchise, as our listeners might know, is Scream. Let's get a Ghostface versus Ghostface movie.
Yeah,
We've never seen it, and it'd be so fun because you wouldn't know who either is, and you could slowly, like, you could learn who one is, and then you still don't know who the other is, and you could have Ghostface trying to like sort of outkill another Ghostface.
I love that. That would be, you know, they without giving too many spoilers because it's a new movie, they kind of were gonna have a little bit of seeds of that in the most recent film, where I don't want to say too much because people are still probably haven't seen it, but there was a little bit of that in there. But I love that idea because it is the ultimate. It's the one character that is trying to always one up and be smart, and unlike Freddy, you or Jason or whoever, it is always multiple people. So
right, you don't need to explain
perfect.
it. Right, like Jason needed the nanobite explanation. Yeah,
I love that idea. I think that would be really a really smart way to go ahead, because everyone's always wondering, oh, is this it's got to be multiple people being Ghostface, since in all but one of the movies there are.
But they've always been unified.
They've been unified. So I love that idea.
They've never been working against each other. All right, Kevin Williamson, call me.
It's perfect with the way that fans react to things too. Like I was just saying with Batman, where people are running polls. So everyone would, the Ghostface would always want to be the number one Ghostface.
And one obviously has to be Nev Campbell, so that'll be her return.
Totally. Yeah. And we saw on Chucky, we saw a bunch of Chuckies on the most recent show. Actually, we saw a good Chucky versus an evil Chucky as well.
We
so
did.
That's another great
Chucky's
character
done
to do
it, but Chucky's done it within their core universe because of the way that there are multiple dolls and Chucky can transfer his consciousness. Like, they've been able to do that kind of plot and not have it be a Jason versus Jason X or have it be a multiverse or time travel story.
Yeah, well, now maybe Chucky will go to outer space in the next series. He's in the White House right now. I wouldn't but I think they're going to do it much better than this movie and comic franchise did.
It's a great show, and it's on break. So if you haven't watched it, go watch it and catch up, everybody, before it comes back next year with the second half of the season. But for now, that's a wrap. Dear watchers, thank you for listening. I have been Guido X.
And Uber Rob here.
Yes, and our reading list / watching list is in the show notes, though you don't need to do any of it. Just listen to our summaries.
they're full enough. And give us a 5-star review wherever you listen to podcasts. We'll be back soon with another trip through the multiverse.
In the meantime, in the words of Uatu, keep pondering the possibilities.
And happy Halloween.